David had only given a piece of pork to the widow and her daughter. Was it necessary for you to lose your temper over that? Lisa just lost her husband and is raising her child alone. She can only make a living by doing some sewing. Look at how thin that child has become. Don't you feel any pity? Before Jack left, I promised him I'd take care of Lisa and her daughter. Do you want to push me into a situation where I am seen as untrustworthy and dishonorable? David's voice echoed in my ears as I clutched my chest, feeling a sharp pain tighten in my heart. Images from my past life flashed vividly before me. My son and in-laws pressuring me to sign the divorce papers. Mom, you're not good enough for Dad. He deserves someone better. In love, the one who isn't loved is the third party. You've spent your whole life serving us. It's us, the elders, who owe you, not Dad. If you feel resentment, take it out on us. You've already ruined half of Dad's life. Don't ruin the rest of it. I hadn't done anything wrong, but all their accusations were directed at me. They blamed me for not being pretty, for not being educated, for being manipulative, as if I had intentionally been good to my in-laws because I saw potential in David. In the end, my son grabbed my hand and forced my fingerprint onto the divorce papers. My whole body shook with anger as my heart throbbed painfully. I never thought the son I had raised with so much effort would treat me like this. I took several deep breaths, my eyes red and filled with unshed tears. When I finally looked up, David was in front of me, trying to persuade me with what seemed like heartfelt sincerity. Even if 20 more years were added to his age, his upright posture wouldn't have changed, compared to his polished demeanor and Lisa's lingering grace. I, a woman who had spent my life doing hard, dirty work, indeed looked like a fool. Don't look at me like that. I've done nothing wrong, he said, his tone self-righteous as he averted his gaze. His expression was identical to the one he wore in my past life when he forced me to divorce him. I didn't bother to respond. Let them think what they wanted. That piece of pork he gave away was something I had spent a whole day and night waiting in line to buy, meant to nourish our son and his grandparents. I turned and walked out of the house. My in-laws called after me, urging me to come back. And my son cried, "Mom," as he ran after me, even when he stumbled and fell, scraping his chin and crying loudly. I didn't stop. I ran all the way to the factory and arrived just before it closed. I found the supervisor. "Are you sure you want to join the Western Development Program?" the supervisor asked, his face filled with disbelief. "Yes, I'm sure," I said firmly. The supervisor frowned. "Does your husband, David, know about this?" "He doesn't need to know. I make my own decisions," I replied. The supervisor was taken aback. "But your son is only 4 or 5 years old. Are you really willing to leave him behind?" I nodded. "This isn't about being willing or unwilling. I just want to contribute to my country." The supervisor sighed. "You've always said that without the country, there's no home. But going to the Northwest means you might not return for a long time. Are you sure David will let you go?" I smiled faintly. "Don't worry. No one can stop me from dedicating myself to building my country." In the end, the supervisor approved my transfer request. When I returned home, the house was lively. From the doorway, I saw Lisa sitting on a bench with her daughter, chatting and laughing with David. My father-in-law was still lying in bed, while my mother-in-law sat beside him, occasionally joining their conversation. My son was even giving Lisa's daughter his precious white rabbit candy. It was a harmonious, loving scene, a perfect picture of 3 generations living in harmony. As soon as I entered, the warm atmosphere instantly turned cold. Lisa stood up, her face full of gentle concern, and handed me the piece of pork from the table. "Sis, this is the meat David brought over this morning. I thought it would be wasted since I don't know how to cook, so I brought it back to you. There are also some eggs and chives. Use them to make something nutritious for the kids and the elders." I didn't take the pork, leaving her hand awkwardly suspended in mid-air. She hesitated, then added, "Sis, David really just feels sorry for us. A widow and an orphan." David looked at me intently. "There's nothing between us. You have to believe me." "Really?" Lisa pleaded softly, her eyes filled with sincerity. I couldn't be bothered to lift my eyelids. Without saying a word, I walked straight into the inner room. David frowned slightly, then called out, "Go ahead and make dinner." Lisa and her daughter can stay and eat with us. Cook a bit more rice. Without any emotion, I responded, I've already eaten and I'm not hungry. If anyone wants to eat, they can cook for themselves. The whole room fell silent. Everyone froze in disbelief, especially David, whose usually calm expression couldn't hide his surprise. You've eaten. But Mom, Dad, Tao, and the rest of us haven't. How can you be so irresponsible? David's tone was accusatory, his words laced with frustration. In my past life, I had been too responsible. That's why your whole family took advantage of me. Meeting his eyes, I let out a light laugh. That's your mom and dad. David, Tao is also your son. I've been in this family for over 5 years, cooking 3 meals a day without fail. Why should I keep exhausting myself to serve all of you, while you sit around waiting for hot meals to appear? Are your hands and feet broken? Or are you as lazy as your father? David stood up, his tall frame no longer carrying the luster I once saw in him. Lisa, are you cooking or not? Not, I said flatly, then turned and walked into the inner room. I'd had a long day and didn't want to do anything else. I needed rest, to regain my energy, and to prepare for my move to the West in a month. A move where I'd devote myself fully to building the country. My energy and intellect would not be wasted on this household any longer. The pork I had queued an entire day and night to buy ultimately turned into overly salty scraps in Lisa's hands. Even so, it was still pork, edible enough to mix with rice and make a meal out of it. From that point on, I completely stopped cooking. My in-laws scolded me, and my son complained incessantly, but I acted as though I didn't hear them. I made it clear to my in-laws, I'm not the servant of this household. If you want to eat, cook for yourselves or go out and buy food. Just don't bother me. Recently, David had been coming home on time, trying to reason with me. To avoid arguments with him, I took the initiative to apply for overtime at work. This conveniently created an opportunity for Lisa to step in. She began bringing groceries to our home, cooking meals, and taking care of our child, all to impress David. She even went out of her way to serve my in-laws with meticulous care, leaving them completely comfortable and satisfied. David noticed her efforts and grew fond of her. Meanwhile, I tried to come home as late as possible, giving this pair of star-crossed lovers ample time to cultivate their feelings. Let my son experience a stepmother's love. Let my in-laws enjoy the happiness of being cared for by a beautiful daughter-in-law. If Lisa truly wanted to give so much of herself, I was more than happy to take a break. But the truth was, she wasn't cut out for such tasks. Coming from a pampered background, she couldn't carry heavy loads or handle hard work. She nearly set the kitchen on fire while cooking, and her hands swelled like balloons from an allergic reaction after washing clothes. The household chores piled up every day, and everyone's eyes turned to me, expecting me to step in and handle everything. Their remarks carried thinly veiled accusations. Isn't it a daughter-in-law's job to take care of these things? You're being unfilial. David works so hard every day. How can you be so inconsiderate? Your son is so young, and yet you, his mother, won't even feed him properly. I looked at my son, who was crying loudly in my mother-in-law's arms. His little face red and tear-streaked, but I felt nothing, not even a ripple of emotion. Let him cry. He'd stop when he got tired. Let him make a fuss. He'd quiet down eventually. My in-laws weren't my parents, and as for my son, I was prepared to let him go too. I continued to go to work as usual, working overtime until late at night before coming home to sleep. Over time, my indifference forced David to take responsibility for managing the household himself. His soft-heartedness made him incapable of truly ignoring the situation. One evening, I came home to find a plate of ribs and a small serving of greens on the table. David handed me a steaming bowl of rice, gesturing for me to sit down and eat. I glanced toward the inner room. David understood immediately and said, "They're all asleep. Your son kept calling for you." I had to tell him 2 hours of stories just to calm him down. I didn't want to deal with him anymore, and turned to head to the bathroom to wash up before bed. But David blocked my way. I asked the supervisor. The cafeteria didn't provide dinner tonight. I know you're angry with me, but there's no need to take it out on your own body. His words hit home. Yes, why was I punishing my own body for David's sake? My stomach was burning from skipping dinner. I walked over to the table, sat down, and picked up a rib. As soon as I took a bite, David let out a long sigh. Lisa, I've made you suffer these past few years. It's my fault. I've put you through so much. David reflecting on himself? It seemed he was starting to understand how exhausting it was to take care of an entire family. I've been thinking about things a lot lately, he continued. You've been juggling work and managing the household. It's too much for one person. So, I wanted to discuss something with you. Why don't you quit your job? Here it comes. I knew this meal wouldn't be as simple as it looked. Tao's about to start elementary school, and he'll need help with his homework. Mom and Dad's health is also getting worse by the day. If you stop working and focus on taking care of the family, it'll be easier for you. In my past life, he had said the same thing. And what happened? As soon as I resigned, he gave my job to Lisa. The two of them spent their days together, inseparable. Then, when the Western Development Program came up, they used it as an excuse to run away to the frontier together. He built a career out there, and she stayed by his side, playing the role of the loving companion. Not a single penny was sent back home. And without a job, I was left to support the entire household by doing laundry for others. I scrubbed clothes from summer to winter, and then from winter back to summer again. My hands were covered in chilblains and calluses. I still vividly remember the day David and Lisa returned from the frontier. I was covered in grime, wearing patched-up clothes, while Lisa looked radiant, dressed in the most fashionable coat, her face glowing and youthful. I sneered coldly at David and said, "But your parents would much rather have their son by their side. Our salaries are about the same. Does it really matter who earns the money? Why don't you quit your job? And I'll take care of the family." David's face darkened instantly. I'm a man. How can I let a woman support the household? I laughed even louder. Exactly. You're a man. You shouldn't need a woman to support the family. But where has your salary gone all these years? Did it ever benefit this household? His guilty expression was all the answer I needed. I've been saving it. I'll use it when the time comes, he mumbled. I put down my chopsticks, went into the room, and brought out the metal box where we kept our savings. I opened it, pulled out his bank book, and threw it in front of him. You withdraw your salary every month. What have you been doing with it? Care to explain? Or perhaps you can show us where you've saved it. David said nothing. I answered for him. You've been giving it all to Lisa and her daughter, haven't you? That's why they can eat meat at every meal and wear new clothes every day. Meanwhile, your wife has been wearing shoes with holes in them for 2 years because she can't afford a new pair. Your son has to beg for milk powder. Your dad can't even dream of getting a wheelchair. And taking your mom to the hospital for her eye problems is completely out of the question. Your so-called filial piety is nothing but empty words. Words you use to make me fulfill your duties for you. David's frown deepened, but he still tried to justify himself. Lisa lost her husband. They have no source of income. Am I supposed to just stand by and watch them starve to death? I looked at him coldly. Then go ahead. Keep giving all your money to her and her daughter. Let them live well. I don't care. But since you're already giving all your money to Lisa, what will this family eat after I quit my job? Grass? Or maybe mud? David held his breath. His face flushed red with frustration, unable to come up with a response. After a long pause, he looked at me and asked, "What's gotten into you lately?" Before, no matter what I said or did, you would always agree without question. But now, you're argumentative, defiant. You're not the obedient person you used to be. Yes, I used to be submissive, clinging to him because I loved him. I did everything he asked, hoping he would remember my kindness, that he would return my love someday. But now, I've seen the truth. The harder you chase someone, the less they value you. Without another word, I pulled out the divorce papers I had prepared in advance. Sign them. Let's get a divorce. That way, you can pursue the person you truly love. David's expression shifted as he read the bold, black words on the document. He suddenly stood up, slamming his hand onto the table. The plates, bowls, and utensils rattled loudly against the surface. Stop this nonsense. I looked at him calmly. You and I both know this isn't nonsense. Your heart hasn't been with me for a long time. I've never received your love. You like Lisa. You want to give her a home. I'm making it easy for you. David slammed his hand against the table again, his voice rising. How many times do I have to explain? It's just camaraderie from our shared past. I only sympathize with Lisa and her daughter. There's nothing between us. Your idea of nothing. Does that mean you haven't slept together? Haven't kissed, hugged, or held hands? Save your explanations. I'm done listening. I opened the front door and motioned for him to follow me. I led him to a spot just beneath the window of our neighbor, Mrs. Zhang. She had a television, and neighbors often gathered there to watch shows and chat. It didn't take long before the neighborhood gossip turned to Lisa. Did you see Lisa today? She's wearing a new outfit again. That pastel color is just stunning. Yeah. She even made a point of mentioning that the fabric is real high-quality stuff. Custom made in town. It's funny, isn't it? Her husband's dead, but she's living better now than when he was alive. And poor Lisa's sister-in-law. What bad luck she has. Being married to such a spineless man. David is just awful. You're right about that. Lisa's sister-in-law, Jane, is hardworking and capable at the factory and at home. But David? That two-faced scoundrel is sneaking around with Lisa. He looks decent, but he's trash. I've told Jane before. Just divorce him already. She's still young and good-looking, and she earns a decent income. Plenty of good men are eyeing her. Even my relatives ask about her every year during the holidays. They're dying to know if she's divorced yet so they can make their move. And Lisa? That scheming woman hasn't changed a bit. She was chasing men when her husband was alive. And now that he's gone, she's even bolder about it. And David? That idiot can't see what he's giving up. He treats Lisa like a treasure while ignoring Jane completely. I've noticed Jane's been working overtime at the factory lately. She's stopped cooking and doing the laundry at home, too. Looks like she's planning to leave him. We should talk to her. Encourage her to take the leap. It's not like we live in feudal times anymore. Women can thrive on their own after a divorce. Good idea. And while we're at it, we can introduce her to some of our relatives. Let David regret everything. David's face turned ashen as he listened to the chatter. I crossed my arms and looked at him, letting the weight of the gossip settle in the silence. Still think I'm making a fuss? He might look good on the outside, but David's really not someone worth showing off. And those two half-dead parents of his? Any decent girl would steer clear of a family like that. Just wait. If David does marry Lisa, their life together will be a disaster. They'll probably end up divorcing. Lisa's the kind of woman who ruins everything. No matter who she's with, it always ends badly. You know, her late husband worked himself to death trying to earn more money for her. He went days without sleep, pushing himself to the limit. That's why, when he was moving machinery, he lost focus for just a second and ended up caught in it, dying on the spot. The neighbors kept talking and talking. There was so much gossip that I started feeling drowsy, thinking about work the next day. I decided I'd had enough and stood up to head home. David noticed me leaving and quickly followed. His face was as dark as a storm cloud. When we got back, I washed up briefly, climbed into bed, and fell asleep almost immediately. David sat on the edge of the bed, looking at me, opening his mouth as if to say something, but when he saw I wasn't paying him any attention, he gave up. The next morning, we both got ready for work. At the entrance, we ran into Lisa. She tried to greet me, but I ignored her. Then, she called out warmly, "Good morning, David." Surprisingly, David just glanced at her indifferently and kept walking. As we left the apartment complex, I caught a glimpse of Lisa's hurt expression. As we walked side by side, David suddenly reached out, pulled me gently, and draped his scarf over my neck. I was stunned, and then he handed me 2 boiled eggs. "I boiled these before you got up. From now on, I'll make them for you every day." I didn't take them. "There's no need for you to do this." He took a deep breath and said earnestly, "I've been wrong before. I made you suffer. From now on, I'll change. Let's live a good life together." Then, he pulled something else out of his pocket and shoved it into my arms along with the eggs. "Here, this is my salary for the month. From now on, I'll bring every penny home." Without waiting for my response, he turned and walked briskly toward his workplace. Watching his upright figure disappear into the distance, I felt conflicted. You might have pulled some tricks to make David distance himself from me, but you can't change the fact that I'm the one in his heart. I turned to the voice and saw Lisa staring at the money and eggs in my arms, her face twisted with resentment. For years, David has given me all his eggs and his salary. You're only getting this once. We still have a long way to go. She glared at me challengingly. I smirked and, taking advantage of the neighbors gathering in the courtyard, raised my voice. Oh, so my husband brings you eggs every day? And all his salary every month? No wonder he hasn't brought a single penny home. These eggs and this money. He said to give them to you. Here. Take them. Eat well and live well. That's the only way he'll feel at ease. The surrounding neighbors stopped to look. Lisa's face turned beet red, and the arrogance she'd shown earlier vanished in an instant. You're spouting nonsense. David and I are completely innocent. Feigning innocence. I replied. Oh, really? Then where do you get money for a new outfit every 3 to 5 days? If it's not from my husband, is it from some other man? Lisa's face contorted with frustration, her voice rising in protest. Jane, stop accusing me of ridiculous things. I shook my head and clicked my tongue a few times. Poor David. He keeps thinking about you, worrying about you, even while you're busy juggling other men in your life. What a devoted guy. I raised my voice in the direction of Mrs. Zhang and the other women. Ladies, Lisa claims my husband has nothing to do with her. But tell me, where does she get the money for her lavish lifestyle? Which man is secretly funding her? Go back and question your husbands carefully. Mrs. Zhang and the others immediately frowned, their gazes toward Lisa growing more disdainful. Finally, Mrs. Zhang couldn't hold back and strode over to Lisa, sneering harshly. Shameless woman. Daring to act but too scared to admit it. Lisa tried to defend herself. Don't listen to Jane's nonsense. You all know what kind of person I am. Mrs. Zhang scoffed coldly. Oh, we know exactly what kind of person you are. When your husband had just passed, you sent my man a handkerchief. Don't think I don't know what you were up to. Only an idiot like David falls for your tricks. Lisa's eyes reddened, tears threatening to spill. But Mrs. Zhang and the others, now emboldened, didn't hold back. You think you can bully Jane because she's kind? Let me warn you, don't try your tricks on my man. Or else, I'll deal with you myself. Knife in hand. Lisa trembled visibly, her earlier bravado completely shattered. Mrs. Zhang tugged my arm, pulling me away. Jane, this place stinks. Let's go. I need to talk to you anyway. Let her stay here and stew in her own mess. I let Mrs. Zhang lead me toward the factory, leaving Lisa alone, humiliated and unsupported. That evening, as usual, I came home late. There were dishes set out on the table, and David was sitting nearby, his expression gloomy. I could tell he had already heard about the events earlier in the day, the way Mrs. Zhang and I had confronted Lisa, but he didn't bring it up, instead making small talk about trivial things. After dinner, David cleaned up the table and did the dishes. I enjoyed the rare break, washed up, and went to bed. David sat on the edge of the bed, seeming like he wanted to say something, but he hesitated and eventually lay down beside me in silence. Whatever was on his mind, he kept it to himself. For the next 2 weeks or so, life was unusually peaceful. Even when Lisa came by to see David with some excuse, he rejected her coldly, his expression indifferent. My mother-in-law, whose eyesight wasn't the best, still seemed to pick up on the shift. One day, she pulled me aside and said, Jane, David still cares about you the most. You shouldn't stay angry at him. Come home earlier and help him with the household chores. As long as you two work together, things will improve. I gave her a non-committal response, but deep down, I knew this peace wouldn't last. Someone as determined as Lisa wouldn't give up on someone like David so easily. Couple more months passed, and the list of employees selected for the Western Development Project was posted. My name was on it. That evening, when David found out, his face darkened, and he didn't say a word throughout dinner. Later, he finally spoke, his voice tight with frustration. If you go to the West, are you just abandoning me and this family? I replied calmly. Your unit probably has slots for the Western Development Project as well. You should apply. We can bring our child and your parents with us. The unit over there provides housing and meals. The houses are twice the size of what we have here. If we go together, life will be better than it is here. David clenched his teeth, struggling with his response. I can't go. Why not? I pressed. He opened his mouth to answer but then stopped. The words seemingly stuck in his throat. I let out a soft laugh. You don't want to leave Lisa and her daughter behind, do you? Without you, they might not even survive. Anger flashed across his face as he finally snapped, spilling everything in one breath. There's nothing between Lisa and me. I've already given my salary to you, and I haven't had any contact with her for weeks. Why can't you just let it go? I pointed to the injury on David's arm. That's a burn from soldering, isn't it? He quickly rolled down his sleeve. No, it's not. When Mrs. Zhang and the others visited the base during the military parade, they saw you soldering. They went out of their way to ask about it and then told me. Soldering is private work. It's grueling, but it pays well. You can earn more in a month from that than you get from your military salary. And since that money never came to me, I assume it's been going to support Lisa and her daughter. Right. David's face was full of guilt. You can't just leave them with no way to live. I laughed softly. Then let's divorce. That way, you can openly take care of them. No need to sneak out in the middle of the night to knock on her door after I've fallen asleep. His face darkened. You've been pretending to sleep all this time? I shook my head. You probably won't believe this, but Lisa herself told me. Impossible, he retorted, though his voice lacked conviction. I didn't argue. Instead, I grabbed his sleeve. Did Lisa patch this for you? He immediately yanked his arm away. No. She didn't. I didn't have the energy to continue arguing with a man who was clearly lying, so I turned and went back to my room to rest. Later, I overheard my in-laws calling David into their room for a conversation. Our house was small, and their words reached my ears clearly. For once, they were reprimanding him. We didn't say anything before because life was still relatively stable. But now, Jane has made her stance crystal clear. You need to make a choice. You can't have it all. Given our family's situation, if you truly want to be with Lisa, your parents likely won't survive much longer. She's not someone you can build a life with. Son, wake up already. Haven't you suffered enough these past few months? You're barely alive. Your body is covered in injuries. Is it worth it for a woman like her? Live your life with Jane and stop chasing things that aren't meant to be. Despite their age, my in-laws were still sharp. After a night of persuasion, David finally agreed to go to the Northwest with me. But could he actually go? The moment David submitted his application to join the Western Development Program, Lisa came looking for me. Her eyes were filled with rage as she glared at me. I've already endured so much. Why are you forcing me to die? I couldn't help but find her words amusing. How exactly am I forcing you to die? Without David's support, my daughter and I won't even have food to eat. Jane, you're so heartless. I stared at her coldly. Then why don't you bring your child and follow us to the Northwest? You can continue being the other woman. She screamed, her voice cracking. Go to the Northwest? How can I? I don't have the right documents or approval. If I go, they'll send me right back. Well, that's your problem for being so useless. I replied with a smirk. But I'll give you a suggestion. David has a soft heart, and you're good at manipulating him. Fake an illness or come up with some excuse to make him stay. Her brows furrowed as she hesitated. Would you really let him stay behind? I laughed. I'd be thrilled if he divorced me and stayed. Her eyes glinted with cunning as she began to plot. I knew she'd find a way to keep David from leaving. Meanwhile, I focused on preparing for my move to the Northwest. The supervisor had reminded me to stop working overtime and take time to pack, visit with family and friends, and tie up loose ends. After all, who knew when I'd see them again? I went door to door, sharing old memories and dreams for the future. David followed me everywhere, joining in the conversations. For a moment, it felt like a farewell tour of sorts. But then, news broke that Lisa had attempted suicide. Despite his usual composure, David panicked. He immediately abandoned me and ran to her house. By the time I arrived at the hospital, Lisa was alive but weak, cradled in David's arms. Tears streamed down Lisa's face as she clung weakly to David, her voice trembling. David, Please don't leave me. I'll be good. I'll listen. I won't interfere with your family. Just don't go. Okay? I'm begging you. Don't leave. Her pleas were so pitiful that even as a bystander, my heart softened for a moment. How could David, the man directly involved in this scene, resist? Naturally, we all heard his response. I'm not going. I won't leave. Stay strong, we're almost at the hospital. Don't worry. I'll take care of you and your daughter. The words spilled from his mouth like a vow, and everyone in the apartment complex heard it. The furrowed brows and exchanged glances said it all. When the ambulance arrived, David accompanied Lisa to the hospital. I stood with the other women, all of them waiting for my reaction. Mrs. Zhang hesitated, wanting to console me, but before she could speak, I broke the silence. Don't worry, ladies. I'm not upset. Not in the least. In fact, I hope you'll all be my witnesses. David is the one who betrayed me first, so when I push for divorce, I'll need your support. Mrs. Zhang immediately chimed in. Don't worry, Jane. A man like that will regret it. Divorce him. Who knows? He might end up being the one who can't live without you. The others nodded in agreement, their support warming my heart. David stayed at the hospital with Lisa for an entire week. During that time, he withdrew his application for the Western Development Project. When he returned, he didn't care about the judgmental stares from the neighbors. He carried Lisa back to our home, looking after her meticulously, cooking, cleaning, and tending to her every need. Yet even after all that, he refused to file for divorce. Even if you don't go to the Northwest, we're not getting divorced. You just have to trust me. There's nothing between Lisa and me. I swear. I'll never do anything to betray you. The irony of his promise was laughable. He'd already done so much to betray me, and yet he had the audacity to make such a declaration. Did he really believe that as long as he didn't sleep with Lisa, it didn't count as betrayal? Mrs. Zhang couldn't stand to see me being dragged down by such an irresponsible man. She rallied the other women, and together they began confronting Lisa daily. The insults they hurled at her were mild compared to their rage. If they had their way, they'd throw her into a pig cage. Lisa, humiliated by their attacks, naturally turned to David for comfort. Unable to resist her tears, David tried to mediate, but the situation only worsened. Eventually, David was forced to file for divorce. The higher-ups, aware of the situation, approved the divorce quickly. On the day the divorce certificate was issued, David looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. Did it really have to come to this? He sounded reluctant, almost regretful. I felt nothing but relief. You're the one who brought it to this point. I simply followed through. With that, I picked up my luggage and turned to leave. What about Tao? Don't you care about him at all? He asked, his voice almost pleading. I smiled and replied, everyone has their own path to walk from the moment they're born. Tao has his, too. Since you chose to stay for your parents, you can look after Tao as well. There's nothing more to think about. He grabbed my arm, his eyes filled with unspoken words, but I had no desire to hear them. Have some dignity. David, you've already betrayed me. Don't betray her too. Let me go. Jane, I can't let you go. But I've already let you go. With that, I boarded the train to the Northwest. David chased after me, but I didn't spare him a single glance. All I wanted was for the train to go faster, to take me far, far away. And so began my 30 years of building a new life in the Northwest. I remarried. My husband is a kind and wonderful man who treats me exceptionally well. Due to our busy work schedules, we never had children, but neither of us felt strongly about having them. Instead, we've enjoyed the simplicity of our life together. Over the years, I advanced from a factory worker to a factory director. With time and changing circumstances, I was later transferred back to my hometown, taking up a significant position managing the province's mineral resource development. My husband, ever supportive, moved with me. Life was calm, like a still river, until one day during an inspection in the countryside, I encountered David. He stood among a group of coal miners, his skin darkened from years of labor, his hair completely white, and one arm missing. His once tall and upright figure had become hunched and frail. His head was bowed, and his eyes, devoid of light, reflected a man worn down by time and hardship. I wasn't surprised to see him like this. Over the years, I had stayed in touch with Mrs. Zhang, who had kept me updated on his life. I knew that the year after I left, David married Lisa. The following year, due to Lisa's negligence, David's parents died of carbon monoxide poisoning. Tragically, their son, Tao, also perished in the same incident. With no children or elders to care for, David and Lisa lived a few good years together. But when the military underwent reform, David was forced to transition to a civilian job at a small factory. By coincidence, he was assigned to the same position I had once held, managing machinery. However, the factory's profitability declined year by year, and his salary dwindled. Lisa, with her extravagant habits, soon grew dissatisfied with David's reduced income. In an effort to satisfy her vanity, David took on dangerous black market work to earn extra money. Lisa constantly compared him to other men, pointing out how they had bought cars or refrigerators. Soft-hearted and prideful, David worked tirelessly to provide for her. Over the years, Lisa maintained her youthful beauty, but David's appearance became utterly unrecognizable. His health deteriorated from the endless labor, and one day, while operating machinery, his arm was caught in the gears, leaving him permanently disabled. When he returned from the hospital, there was no trace of the handsome man he once was. Lisa began to despise him, unable to endure loneliness. She started an affair with the local tailor. The scandal came to light in David's own home. Trembling with rage, he still refrained from confronting her outright. Even if they divorced, he wanted to end things with dignity. But then, while hiding in a cupboard to avoid a confrontation, he overheard Lisa and her lover talking. They admitted that Lisa had intentionally orchestrated the carbon monoxide poisoning that killed David's parents and son. Unable to contain himself, David grabbed a knife from the kitchen and killed Lisa in a fit of rage. Due to his past military service and the extenuating circumstances, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. After his release, no one was willing to hire him. Out of desperation, he ended up working at a coal mine, where he remained for decades. As for Lisa's child, after David was imprisoned, the child ran off with a man, and no one knows their current whereabouts. As the inspection at the rural coal mine concluded and I prepared to leave, David stood by the side of my car. His eyes, filled with a mix of sorrow and longing, fixated on me. I walked over and greeted him warmly. "It's been a long time." He swallowed hard, his eyes brimming with tears. "Yes, it's been a long time." David and I locked eyes, neither of us able to say a word. The silence stretched until I got into the car. As we pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw David collapse to the ground, wailing in despair. My husband, sitting beside me, asked, "What happened to that disabled man?" I replied calmly, "Maybe life has been too hard on him." He nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, at his age, still working in the coal mines. It must be grueling. Coal miners' wages should probably be raised to reflect their effort." Back in the provincial capital, I compiled a report detailing the working conditions of coal miners and submitted it to the higher authorities. Not long after, news came back that wages for coal miners were being increased. But along with that good news came another report. David had taken his own life at the mine. My husband expressed regret. It looked like life was just about to improve for him. How could he not hold on? I sighed softly. Perhaps not everyone is meant to benefit from the blessings of a new era. After I agreed to the arranged marriage with Andrew Carter, news of the upcoming union between the Carter and Johnson families quickly spread throughout the entire city of Riverdale. Yet, the media unanimously assumed that my fiancé was Andrew Carter, not his younger brother, Daniel Carter. In my previous life, I thought I had everything figured out. I endured years of humiliation and heartbreak, clinging to my love for Andrew, believing that if I just held on a little longer, he would eventually see my worth. But I was wrong. The day I died was seared into my memory. It was raining heavily, the kind of cold, unrelenting storm that seemed to mirror my despair. I had overheard Andrew and Anna plotting to use me one last time to secure his position as heir. The betrayal was like a knife twisting in my chest. Yet, even as I confronted him, begging for an ounce of truth, he laughed in my face. His words cut deeper than any blade ever could. You were always just a pawn. Emma, you were never worth more than that. Blinded by heartbreak, I ran out into the storm, unsure of where I was going. I slipped on the wet pavement near the cliffs that overlooked the ocean. I remember the sensation of falling, the world blurring around me, the sound of waves roaring beneath me, and then nothing. When I woke up, I found myself in my teenage body, standing in front of my family's mansion, clutching the invitation to my engagement party with Andrew. First, I thought it was a cruel dream, but the vividness of it all and the familiar faces I hadn't seen in years told me otherwise. I was alive. I had been reborn. In that moment, I realized I had been given a second chance, not to hold on to the past, but to rewrite my future. I promised myself that this time, I would no longer live for others who didn't deserve my loyalty. I would take back control of my life and ensure that those who hurt me paid for their sins. This rebirth wasn't just a blessing. It was the universe's way of giving me justice. At a cafe, I had just seen off the reporter, Diane Tang, whom I'd invited. That was when Andrew and his group of friends came straight toward me. I intended to pretend not to see them. However, Andrew, who usually treated me like I didn't exist, did something completely out of character and walked directly up to me. Emma Johnson, are you so unwanted that you had to come up with this pathetic idea of involving the media to force me into marriage? His tone was cold, his eyes filled with disdain. Do you think I'd ever agree to this? Don't even dream about it. I'll never marry you. His harsh words, combined with his look of utter contempt, sent a sharp pain through my chest that I couldn't control. I instinctively opened my mouth to explain. I didn't. But one of his friends immediately interrupted me. Andrew, wasn't that Diane Tang, the famous entertainment gossip reporter in Riverdale, sitting with her just now? Upon hearing this, Andrew became even more convinced that I had deliberately leaked the news to the media. His eyes grew colder, the loathing in his gaze even more apparent. I blinked, suppressing the stinging in my eyes. When I opened them again, they were calm and composed. I only asked the reporter to clarify that the engagement isn't with you, but with Daniel. As soon as the words left my mouth, I heard mocking laughter around me. Andrew's friends looked at me with ridicule and amusement. One of them smirked and said, Emma, don't make us laugh. Everyone knows you've been infatuated with Andrew for years, practically obsessed with him. You probably even dream of marrying him. Clarifying things with a reporter? Please. You're just looking for another way to stir up rumors. But no matter what you do, Andrew will never like you. Andrew narrowed his eyes at me, his expression sharp and disdainful. Emma Johnson, you've been lying so long it's become second nature to you. Everyone in Riverdale knows how you've been clinging to me, acting like you can't live without me. Who else would you even consider marrying? Fine. I won't expose your lies publicly. I'll let you keep pretending to be my fiancé for the sake of appearances. But don't expect anything else from me. You don't deserve it. I stared at him, stunned. In my past life, his attitude toward the arranged marriage had been cold but indifferent. He hadn't explicitly opposed it. That indifference had given me hope. And I had foolishly married him. What had changed this time? While I was lost in thought, the previously noisy cafe suddenly fell silent. I looked up in confusion and saw her, Anna Lewis, Andrew's so-called true love. She stood at the entrance, her delicate features painted with hurt and sorrow as she looked at Andrew and me. Anna slowly walked over and took off a ring from her finger. She placed it in my hand, her voice trembling. I only found out about your engagement from the news. It's not appropriate for me to keep this ring Andrew gave me anymore. Here, I'm returning it to you. Her voice faltered as she added, but the ring has both our names engraved on it. Andrew engraved it himself. I hope you don't mind. Emma, I wish you two happiness. As she spoke the last words, tears spilled from her eyes. She looked as if she couldn't bear it any longer. Turning to leave, she stumbled before she could reach the door. Andrew immediately snatched the ring from my hand, shoved me aside, and rushed to her. He cradled her in his arms, his face filled with concern as he checked her condition. Anna, frail and delicate, looked up at me from his embrace, her gaze filled with triumph and provocation, just as Andrew, now visibly anxious, prepared to take her to the hospital. Anna struggled to her feet and limped toward me. She stood in front of me with Andrew's support. Her face was filled with worry, but there was a subtle challenge in her gaze. "Miss Johnson, please don't misunderstand," Anna said softly. "Andrew is just concerned about me. He always has been. After all, I've been the most important person in his heart for years. But really, there's nothing between us. I hope you don't take it the wrong way." The people around us exchanged amused glances, clearly anticipating some drama. They all knew how much I had cared about Andrew for over a decade. Anytime a woman seemed close to him, I would lose my composure, yelling and making a scene, afraid someone would take him away from me. Andrew was clearly prepared for me to erupt in anger again. He held Anna protectively in his arms, as if shielding his beloved from any potential harm I might cause. But instead, I just looked at them calmly, without doing anything undignified or embarrassing. Andrew seemed caught off guard by my lack of reaction. He released the arm he had wrapped around Anna and spoke again, his tone now tinged with frustration and embarrassment. "At least you're smart enough not to hurt Anna this time. Otherwise, I wouldn't have let you off so easily." After saying that, he bent down, scooped Anna into his arms, and carried her out of the cafe. Just before they exited, Anna looped her arms around Andrew's neck and turned her gaze toward me. Her voice sounded sincere, but her eyes were full of smugness. "Andrew, it's hard to get a cab around here. Why don't we give Miss Johnson a ride home?" she suggested. Andrew stopped in his tracks. The tenderness in his eyes as he looked at Anna disappeared the moment he glanced at me. His expression turned impatient. "Emma Johnson, are you deaf? Didn't you hear what Anna said? Hurry up and get in. I'll take you home," he snapped. I wanted to refuse, but seeing the malicious, gossip-hungry eyes around me and realizing my phone was drenched in spilled coffee and wouldn't turn on, I reluctantly followed them. As a representative of the Johnson family, I couldn't afford to leave myself open to further rumors. In the parking lot, Andrew carefully placed Anna in the front passenger seat and even fastened her seatbelt for her. As he leaned away, her lips accidentally brushed his cheek. Their eyes met, and they naturally kissed. I raised an eyebrow at the scene but said nothing, slipping into the back seat without a word. The sound of the back door closing seemed to remind Andrew of my presence. He hastily pushed Anna away and glanced at me, his expression unreadable. His hand instinctively rested near Anna, as if ready to shield her in case I lashed out. But when he saw me calmly resting my chin on my hand, entirely unbothered, his hand froze awkwardly mid-air. After a long moment, his face darkened, and he stomped to the driver's seat, slamming the door behind him. As the car started, Anna pointed to a small sticker on the dashboard that read, "Anna's reserved seat. No trespassing." She giggled and said in a voice just loud enough for me to hear, "Oh, Andrew, isn't this the sticker I put on your car that day as a joke? I can't believe you still have it. Won't it make Miss Johnson misunderstand? I should take it off." She reached toward the sticker but made no actual move to remove it. Instead, she looked back at me, her eyes glinting with provocation. In the past, I might have taken the bait and been deeply upset, but now, I found her antics childish and ridiculous, utterly boring. Andrew glanced at me in the rearview mirror, his expression difficult to read. He suddenly raised his voice. "Take it off? No way. The front seat is yours. Anna. Always has been. No one else should even think about sitting there." When we arrived at my apartment complex, Andrew parked the car and got out with me. I glanced at him following me, puzzled but unwilling to ask about his intentions. I turned to head inside without a word. Seeing me about to leave, Andrew suddenly reached out and grabbed my arm. I looked at him as he held a brooch in his hand and forcefully stuffed it into mine. His tone carried a hint of disdain and contempt. "Take this. Accept my gift and stop causing trouble. I'm allowing you to carry the title of my fiancé in public, but you need to know your place. Don't ever upset Anna or make her uncomfortable, and don't think that pretending to be indifferent like today will catch my attention. My heart will always belong to Anna. Don't harbor any delusions." After finishing his speech, Andrew turned and walked away. I glanced down at the brooch he had shoved into my hand and couldn't help but find it amusing. I recognized this brooch. It was a custom gift that came with a luxury women's watch. The same watch I had seen Anna wearing earlier today. Shaking my head, I casually tossed the brooch into the trash can by the door and went home. After washing up, I lay in bed, unable to fall asleep. In my previous life, by this time, Anna had already left the country. Yet, in this life, she was still here with no sign of leaving. What had changed? Could Anna also have been reborn like me? As these thoughts swirled in my head, I eventually drifted off to sleep, dreaming about my past life. Back then, I had chosen to proceed with the engagement to Andrew, to ensure the smooth alliance between the two families. Andrew's father secretly arranged a meeting with Anna, offering her $5 million to leave the country. Anna accepted the money and left. But before she departed, she deliberately spread rumors, making Andrew believe that I had forced her out so I could marry him. In retaliation, Andrew married me, only to continually raise my hopes and crush them. The next morning, I stepped out of my room and found my parents chatting in the living room. My mother mentioned that Andrew's older brother, Christopher, would be returning today, and tonight's banquet would not only welcome him home but also serve as our engagement party. I nodded, but my palms clenched tightly. In my past life, Christopher had also returned on this very day, but his private jet had tragically crashed, resulting in his untimely death. This time, I had already warned him not to take the private jet, so the tragedy should be averted. Even so, I couldn't shake the unease in my heart. To calm myself, I decided to drive to the seaside villa. The villa housed the rose garden I had cultivated since childhood. Standing amidst the roses always brought me peace. I had originally created the rose garden because Andrew once mentioned that roses were his favorite flower. For him, I had collected various rose seeds and planted them in the garden. Over the past decade, the garden had grown into a beautiful, flourishing oasis. But as I drove into the villa, I was shocked to find the entire rose garden destroyed. Only a few roses in the corners remained untouched. My brows furrowed as I surveyed the scene of destruction. I took out my phone to call the police. But before I could dial, I heard Andrew and Anna's voices in the distance. Striding quickly toward the sound, I found Andrew sitting on a swing entwined with roses. Anna leaned intimately against him, her laughter bright and carefree. Fury surged through me as I clenched my fists and forcibly stopped the swing. Glaring at them, I demanded, "Who gave you permission to be here? And who told you it was okay to destroy my rose garden?" Anna's cheerful expression instantly shifted to one of pitiful innocence. "Miss Johnson, it's my fault. I told Andrew I liked rose swings, so he brought me here and made one for me himself. His hands were even injured by the thorns while he was building it. If you're angry, blame me. Please don't blame Andrew." Andrew immediately shielded Anna behind him and looked at me with a mixture of impatience and disdain. "Emma Johnson, are you done? It's just a few roses. Do you have to be so petty?" I was so furious at Andrew and Anna that my chest heaved with anger. These two had destroyed the rose garden I had cultivated for years, and still had the audacity to call me petty. Andrew's voice was dripping with disdain as he added, "And who doesn't know this garden was originally planted for me? I only used a few roses. Why are you so angry? Are you jealous because I made a swing for Anna? What right do you have to be jealous of her?" His mocking gaze swept over me as if I were insignificant. "Stop making a fuss. Once Anna's done using the swing, it's yours. I made it myself, so consider it a gift." I was nearly blinded by rage at his shamelessness. 1,000 retorts clogged my throat, but my upbringing restrained me from saying anything unbecoming. Beside him, Anna interjected with a soft, seemingly innocent tone. "Miss Johnson, I'm just about finished with it anyway. Consider the swing and the roses yours again." She got off the swing as she spoke, but in a seemingly accidental motion, she loosened the knot securing the swing to the frame. As soon as she stepped away, she gave me a slight push toward it. Without the knot holding it in place, the swing collapsed suddenly, its wooden pieces crashing down toward me. Andrew instinctively pulled Anna into his arms, shielding her protectively. Meanwhile, a heavy plank struck my shin, sending me tumbling painfully to the ground. For a fleeting moment, I saw a flicker of concern flash across Andrew's face as he glanced at my injury. He was about to step toward me, but Anna grabbed his arm, her voice trembling with feigned guilt. "Miss Johnson, I already said I'd give the swing and the roses back to you. How could you deliberately break the swing and hurt yourself just to frame me? Andrew made that swing with his own hands. How could you be so heartless? The sharp pain clouded my mind, leaving me momentarily disoriented. My face was pale, and cold sweat trickled down my forehead. I couldn't hear most of what they were saying. Struggling to focus, I instinctively reached out to Andrew and pleaded, "Help me." But instead of helping, Andrew stepped on my outstretched hand, pinning it to the ground with anger blazing in his eyes. "Emma Johnson, are you that desperate to marry me? So desperate that you'd hurt yourself to frame Anna? You leave me no choice but to teach you a lesson today." He spat venomously. He picked up another piece of the broken swing and slammed it onto my waist with deliberate force. Then he crushed my phone under his foot, his voice sharp and commanding. "Kneel before Anna and apologize. You don't get to stand until she forgives you." When I didn't respond immediately, his anger flared even further. He kicked me hard, his tone menacing. "Emma Johnson, don't forget that tonight is supposed to be our engagement party, but it doesn't have to be. With one word, I can cancel it. Now, kneel like a dog and beg for Anna's forgiveness, or there will be no groom at tonight's party." Fighting through the searing pain, I looked up at them, my voice steady and deliberate as I said, "I told you, I'm not marrying you, and I will never apologize to her." My words startled Andrew. A flicker of doubt crossed his face. But before he could speak, his phone chimed with a message. After reading it, the hesitation in his expression vanished, replaced by smug arrogance. "Emma Johnson, you almost fooled me. You say you don't want to marry me, yet you ordered Manchester roses for tonight. Everyone knows those are my favorite. Still want to deny that you're trying to win me over." I wanted to explain that the roses were for Christopher, who also loved Manchester roses, but Andrew didn't give me a chance to speak. His eyes filled with disgust as he said, "I'll take Anna to the party first. Since you refuse to kneel and apologize here, you can do it at the party in front of everyone. If you don't kneel, there will be no groom at this engagement." He turned to leave with Anna, adding coldly, "Anna and I, along with the guests, will be waiting for you at the engagement party." After finishing his words, Andrew turned and left with Anna in his arms. The searing pain in my lower back was nearly unbearable, but watching them disappear from my sight filled me with an even deeper sense of despair. Who would save me? The excruciating pain finally overwhelmed me, and I passed out. What I didn't see was a tall, slender man stepping out from the shadows. After glancing at my unconscious form, he gently picked me up and carried me away. When I woke up again, the first thing I noticed was the sharp scent of disinfectant filling the air. I was lying in a hospital room, testing my body cautiously. I tried to move, but the pain stopped me in my tracks, and I couldn't help but cry out softly, "Don't move. Your injuries aren't healed yet." A deep, magnetic voice advised. Startled, I realized there was someone else in the room. Turning toward the voice, I saw a man with features bearing a striking resemblance to Andrew. I immediately recognized him as Christopher Carter, Andrew's older brother. Relief washed over me at the sight of him, and the nervous tension in my chest eased. I gave him a broad smile and said, "You made it back safely." Christopher raised an eyebrow at my words, and a hint of warmth appeared in his gaze. "Was the anonymous message from you?" I nodded. "How did you know someone tampered with my private jet? And why did you decide to help me?" His tone carried curiosity but no malice, only genuine intrigue and gratitude. Meeting his calm gaze, I decided to answer honestly. "Would you believe me if I told you I dreamed about it last night? As for why I wanted to save you, it's simple. You're my fiancé." He froze for a moment, clearly caught off guard, but then he nodded. "I believe you." His unexpected response surprised me, realizing that he had been the one to rescue me. I looked at him with both gratitude and a hint of confusion. "Thank you for saving me, but why were you there in the first place?" He explained. "After receiving your message, I was skeptical at first, but I'm not someone who takes unnecessary risks. So I had the jet thoroughly inspected. It turned out that someone really had tampered with the engine. Naturally, I became suspicious of the person who sent the warning. I had someone investigate you." "Sorry." His gaze flickered toward me, watching for any sign of anger or hostility. When I didn't react negatively, he continued. "At first, I just wanted to meet the person who sent the message. But when I found you, you were injured and unconscious. So, I brought you to the hospital. I looked at him. My curiosity piqued. Why didn't you suspect me? Instinct, he replied with a faint smile. I trust that my fiancé isn't a bad person. We exchanged a small, mutual smile. And for the first time, I felt a genuine sense of admiration for Christopher. He was so different from Andrew. Honest, humble, and kind. In stark contrast, Andrew was arrogant and selfish. After being discharged from the hospital, Christopher and I returned to the Carter family estate. That evening, the Carters and the Johnsons were hosting a small banquet together. The entrance was bustling with guests coming and going, and Andrew stood at the door of the banquet hall, welcoming attendees. When Christopher and I appeared arm in arm at the entrance, Andrew's face drained of color, and he stared at us as if he had seen a ghost. Shocked, he stammered, Big brother? How are you here? Are you a ghost?" His reaction made both Christopher and me instinctively look up at him. Andrew's eyes were filled with genuine fear and disbelief. In that instant, something clicked in my mind. I realized Andrew had also been reborn. It explained everything. Why Anna had stayed in the country instead of leaving. Why Andrew had been so desperate to protect her. And why he seemed so wary of me. As Andrew's accusing gaze darted toward Christopher, I could tell he suspected that Christopher had orchestrated the sabotage of his jet. Such suspicions weren't far-fetched in wealthy families like the Carters, where rivalry among siblings was commonplace. I couldn't entirely blame Andrew for his mistrust. After all, in his previous life, he had been reborn and yet remained indifferent to Christopher's impending plane crash, letting him die without lifting a finger to prevent it. Most people wouldn't have been capable of such cruelty. But Andrew had proven himself to be an exception. Though I was already familiar with Andrew's selfish and malicious nature, he always managed to surpass my expectations, revealing new depths to his depravity. After entering the banquet, Christopher excused himself and went to the study. I assumed he was investigating the reason behind the malfunction on his private jet, so I didn't think much of it. I waited in the lounge while the makeup artist finished doing my makeup. Suddenly, Andrew barged in without warning, shoving the makeup artist out of the room. He grabbed my wrist roughly, his eyes blazing with anger. "Emma Johnson, I'm warning you. Stay away from Anna. If you hurt her again, I won't just come after you. I'll destroy the Johnson family too." The intertwined hatred from both my past and current lives boiled over, and I yanked my wrist free with all the strength I could muster. Without thinking, I slapped him hard across the face. "Who gave you permission to enter? Get out." A red handprint appeared on Andrew's cheek as he glared at me with barely restrained rage. He raised his hand as if to strike me back but hesitated under the full force of my furious glare. His hand dropped, and his voice softened, though it still carried a condescending edge. "I know you're only doing all this because you like me. You're desperate to marry me. As long as you promise not to harm Anna anymore, I'll let today's engagement happen without holding it against you. But after we're engaged, remember your place. You'll be my fiancé in name only, achieved through underhanded means. Don't ever cross Anna again." He continued with an air of self-righteousness. "Even if my father forces me to marry you one day, my heart will always belong to Anna. Once we're married, I'll bring Anna home, and you'll help cover for her. You'll praise her in front of my father and convince him to accept her as soon as possible. Do you understand?" As if granting me a tremendous favor, he added, "If you can do all this, I might occasionally come home so you can have my child. But don't expect anything more. My heart will only ever belong to Anna. The Carter family fortune will go to my and Anna's children, not yours. But if you behave well, I'll consider letting your family invest in Carter Industries. After all, I know the future trends of the market and industries over the next few decades." Listening to his absurd arrogance, I couldn't help but sneer internally. Andrew truly believed his rebirth had given him omniscience over the future. Did he not realize that the world was ever-changing? Even the flutter of a butterfly's wings could create a hurricane. He actually thought he could replicate his past life's trajectory. I was eager to see how his blind arrogance would backfire. After his self-important monologue, Andrew strode out of the lounge. Watching him leave, I couldn't suppress a cold smile from curling on my lips. Shortly afterward, Christopher approached me with a stack of documents in hand. At some point, he had changed into a tailored white suit that perfectly outlined his tall, elegant figure. He looked like a prince straight out of a fairy tale. When he reached out his hand toward me, I instinctively placed mine in his, allowing him to escort me to the banquet hall. Andrew, who was still lost in his self-made fantasy, turned to look at us as we entered together. His expression darkened, his gaze filled with simmering anger. Still, he maintained his composure in front of the crowd, pulling out the chair beside him and gesturing for me to sit. His eyes were filled with smug arrogance, as if certain I would gratefully take the seat he offered. Instead, I didn't even glance at him. I walked past him and sat in the chair Christopher had pulled out for me. Andrew's face twisted with suppressed fury as he shot me a warning look. Lowering his head, he quickly typed something on his phone. Moments later, my phone buzzed with a notification. I opened it to see a message from Andrew. Emma Johnson. Stop playing these little games to get my attention. I'm not falling for it. This is your final warning. Don't do anything unnecessary, or this engagement will be cancelled on the spot. You won't even have the title of my fiancé left. Amused by his delusions, I blocked him without a second thought and set my phone down. When Christopher noticed my slight action, he asked gently, "Is everything okay?" Smiling faintly, I replied, "It's nothing, just an irrelevant person. Already dealt with." Satisfied, Christopher nodded and began placing food on my plate. He waited until I took a bite before saying, "If anything comes up that you can't handle, let me know. It's my responsibility as your fiancé to take care of any trouble for you." Looking at Christopher's composed and sincere expression, my heart skipped a beat, and my ears grew warm. He truly was an exceptional person, and soon, he would officially become my fiancé. I lowered my head and gave Christopher a knowing smile. Our interaction only deepened the fury in Andrew's eyes. He picked up his phone again to send me another message, only to discover that I had blocked him. Seeing the red exclamation mark on his screen, Andrew's rage reached its boiling point, clouding his judgment. That moment, Anna, disguised as a server, sneaked into the banquet hall. Andrew immediately pulled her to his side, his abrupt action drawing the attention of everyone around them. Anna, flustered by his gesture, lowered her head in apparent shyness. The crowd, filled with shrewd onlookers, quickly pieced together what was happening. Their gazes toward Andrew and Anna were laced with disdain. To openly bring a mistress to a formal family banquet showed a blatant disregard for the Carter family's reputation. Compared to his older brother, Andrew was seen as immature and irresponsible, oblivious to the scornful stares directed at him. Andrew, consumed by anger, sent another message. "Blocking me on WeChat? You've got some nerve. Just wait. I'm going to announce in front of everyone that I will never marry you. The only woman I'll ever marry is Anna, even if it means giving up my place as the Carter family heir. That will never change." I coldly watched Andrew's tantrum, then decisively blocked his phone number. His fury deepened as he realized what I had done. Shortly after, Mr. Carter, the family patriarch, took the stage to deliver a brief welcome speech. He then publicly announced the union between the Carter and Johnson families. Andrew, not missing a beat, stormed onto the stage, dragging Anna with him. Holding her hand high, he declared, "Anna Lewis is my one true love. I'll never marry anyone but her. If I'm forced into an arranged marriage with Emma Johnson, I'd rather sever ties with the Carter family than compromise." His eyes sparkled with vindictive glee, while Anna, nestled in his arms, wore a soft, triumphant smile. They both looked at me, expecting to see heartbreak and despair on my face. Unfortunately for them, I remained completely unfazed, my expression unreadable. Andrew's satisfaction began to falter, confusion creeping into his features. He couldn't understand why someone who had loved him for over a decade would react so indifferently to his public rejection. Even the audience didn't react as he had hoped. Instead of admiring his supposed unwavering love for Anna, their gazes were filled with disdain, seeing him as nothing more than a clown making a fool of himself. The only person truly enraged was Mr. Carter. With the Carter family business facing a critical juncture, the alliance with the Johnson family was crucial. Any disruption could spell disaster. Watching his second son make a spectacle of himself and tarnish the family name, especially compared to the capable and composed Christopher, was the final straw. Mr. Carter's brows furrowed tightly. Closing his eyes for a brief moment, he opened them again with resolute determination. He stepped onto the stage, completely ignoring Anna, whom Andrew was shielding protectively. Taking the microphone, his voice carried the weight of finality. "Welcome, everyone, to the engagement banquet between the Carter and Johnson families. Before the ceremony begins, I have two important announcements to make. First, the person engaged to Miss Emma Johnson has always been my eldest son, Christopher Carter. Second, the future heir of the Carter family will also remain Christopher Carter." Pausing briefly, he turned his sharp gaze to Andrew, his tone cold and unforgiving. "Since Andrew wishes to renounce his ties to the Carter family in pursuit of his so-called true love, I hereby declare that from this moment onward, Andrew Carter is no longer a member of this family. He is free to chart his own path." Andrew's smug expression vanished instantly, replaced by sheer disbelief. His face drained of color as he stared at his father, unable to process what had just happened. Anna's face turned pale as she darted a glance at Andrew, then at Christopher beside me, and finally settled her gaze on me. Her eyes were filled with reluctance and unwillingness to accept defeat. To prevent Andrew from causing any more trouble at the banquet, Mr. Carter had both him and Anna thrown out. Even as they were dragged out, Andrew remained in a state of shock. He couldn't comprehend how everything had changed so drastically. In his previous life, he had been the uncontested heir of the Carter family, but now, with his brother's return, everything had shifted. His former fiancée was now engaged to Christopher, and he had lost his position as heir. Inside the banquet hall, the celebration continued unaffected by Andrew's disgraceful exit. Guests came forward to congratulate Christopher and me, offering us their blessings and gifts. Outside, Andrew stood, his eyes reddened with rage and a deep-seated sense of injustice. His anger festered, and resentment grew toward both the Johnson and Carter families. "This should have been my engagement," he thought bitterly. "Even if I didn't want her, Emma should have been mine for life." Andrew's hatred for everyone involved solidified as he glared at our engagement ceremony. Meanwhile, he completely failed to notice Anna's increasingly distant attitude. Her gaze was filled with adoration, but it wasn't directed at Andrew. It was aimed squarely at Christopher. Following our engagement, the Johnson and Carter families began a deep partnership. The alliance brought mutual trust and cooperation, allowing both families to weather economic challenges and rise to the top as the leading enterprises in Riverdale. As for Christopher and me, our relationship grew stronger over time. While Christopher focused on his work, I didn't idle either. My guard against Andrew remained high. I knew he wouldn't accept defeat so easily and would eventually try to strike back. However, I wasn't afraid. He had his memories of the past, but so did I. Plus the advantage of living many more years than he had in our previous lives. I decided to take the offensive, cutting off any chance he had to rebuild his influence. One day, I learned about a large anonymous investment in a bid to develop a remote, barren mountain. I couldn't help but smile, knowing Andrew was behind it. He had pinned all his hopes on this project. The barren mountain may have seemed insignificant now, but both of us knew its future potential. It would become the economic center of the region, with land valued at astronomical prices. Deliberately, I arranged for someone to compete with him during the bidding process, driving the price higher and higher. Just as the cost was about to exceed Andrew's financial limits, I ordered the bidding to stop. Predictably, Andrew refused to let go of the opportunity, pouring every available resource into securing the land. He succeeded, but just as he prepared to begin development, I sent an anonymous letter to the National Archaeological Team, informing them of an imperial tomb buried beneath the mountain. In our past lives, my life was cut short by his hands, but my soul lingered, tethered to the world by unfulfilled regrets and an unyielding sense of injustice. I watched as events unfolded long after my death: Andrew's financial ruin, his desperate attempts to regain power, and finally, his downfall when the tomb beneath the barren mountain was discovered. The government was thrown into chaos, torn between salvaging the massive investments poured into the project or preserving the ancient tomb, an invaluable historical treasure. The indecision caused public outrage, leaving Andrew's legacy in shambles. My lingering soul bore witness to it all, a silent observer to the consequences of his arrogance and greed. This time, I acted before Andrew could break ground, ensuring the tomb's existence became public knowledge. The news immediately halted all development. The archaeological team descended on the site, making it their base of operations. Andrew's plans crumbled, and he was left staring helplessly at the bright red tape fencing off the mountain, his bloodshot eyes fixed on the archaeologists who had taken over. As long as the excavation continued, no development could proceed. Investors abandoned the area in droves, leaving Andrew's dreams and his finances in ruins. His gamble had failed spectacularly. Andrew lost everything. After failing to repay a significant amount of debt, Andrew's name was added to the bank's blacklist. He was labeled a defaulter, unable to book flights or high-speed trains, effectively reducing him to a state of social and financial ruin. Once Andrew was penniless. The first person to abandon him was Anna. She took the last bit of money he had, feigning pity and helplessness as she tried to approach Christopher for sympathy. But Christopher wasn't his brother. He saw through Anna's manipulative tactics immediately and sent her back to Andrew without hesitation. Consumed by anger and despair, Andrew's mind broke. In a fit of rage, he killed Anna, strangling her to death before dismembering her body and disposing of the pieces in a sewer. When Anna's remains were discovered, Andrew had already fled, leaving no trace of his whereabouts. I had a lingering feeling that Andrew would come back for me. With that in mind, I reported my concerns to the police, who stayed nearby, ready to act at a moment's notice. Sure enough, Andrew eventually resurfaced. As soon as he appeared, the police apprehended him. His bloodshot eyes stared into mine as he was dragged away. He apologized profusely, tears streaming down his face, and said, "I was blind. I loved the wrong person. I've wronged you. Please, Emma, forgive me. Give me one more chance, and I'll treat you well. I swear the person I truly love is you." I simply looked at him, my expression cold and unchanging. There wasn't a trace of emotion on my face, just as he had looked at me countless times in our past life. The moment he saw my indifferent expression, his struggles ceased, his body stiffened, and I knew he had realized the truth. I was also reborn. With that knowledge, he stopped begging for forgiveness, understanding there was no chance I would ever pardon him. In his final act of desperation, Andrew pulled a box cutter from his clothing and slashed his own throat. Blood poured down his chest as he collapsed heavily to the ground. With his dying breath, he muttered to himself, "I'll do it right next time. Next time, I'll make the right choices." I stared at his lifeless body, his eyes still wide open, and thought to myself, there won't be a next time. This was your only chance. And as for me, I've already used up all the luck I had in this lifetime. There won't be another rebirth. Turning my gaze to Christopher, who was waiting for me in the distance, I felt a sense of peace. In this life, I've already achieved everything I wanted. There's nothing left to regret.